Deep in the backcountry of Mexico, there rises a grim and mysterious mountain, which is said to be hollow. Its interior has never been explored, because at its base lies an impassable swamp. The superstitious link the hollow mountain and the swamp in their folk legends as places of evil, great evil.
So just to kick things off, I'd like to give a little window or insight into my struggle, as it were. I posted the episode from last week for the Journey to the Center of the Earth and the Lost World to the Facebook page for the podcast. And I got one comment on the episode, and I'm not going to name the person. He looks like a kind of typical boomer, but his comment was, all caps, best real lizards with fins glued on award goes to those Dimetrodons on the inner world seashore in Journey to the Center of the Earth. So I'm guessing.
I agree with that.
Well, I'm guessing he didn't listen all the way into the end of the episode where we discussed the kind of horrible implications of treating live animals in that way. So, but I guess that's what I have coming to me, making a podcast that absolutely nobody in my age bracket and only living fossils of another sort are actually interested in.
Look, in defense of that individual, that person, that
it is
boomer,
true.
wait just a second, they are pretty decent looking.
Yeah, of
right?
all the lizards that were forced to wear costumes in dinosaur movies, they had the best makeup job.
That's correct.
It's true.
Good.
Best performances as well. This is, of course, Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. Joining me, as always, is my father, Rocco.
Right, I'm a boomer.
Yeah,
so hello.
He is also a creature out of time and place who has
just like these animals.
Yeah, who has been brought out of his cavern and is slowly being destroyed by a world that he doesn't understand.
Okay.
But yeah, so for this week, we decided to do another double feature, dinosaur Western movies or science fiction Westerns. The first one, The Beast of Hollow Mountain from 1956, and the second one, The Valley of Gwangi from 1969. Both of them being very interesting films because both of them are more or less inspired by the same original idea, or ideas rather, by the stop-motion animator Willis O'Brien. Willis O'Brien was a very prolific guy in his private and creative life, even if he didn't necessarily get all the opportunities that he wanted to make the kinds of films that he wanted to make. And among his various ideas for a film project that he thought would be best suited for his stop-motion animation process were various ideas that more or less all involved the idea of putting dinosaurs in a turn-of-the-century Western setting. There are basically two movies, or rather movie concepts, that are behind the inspiration of both of these films. And, you know, Willis O'Brien was a guy who, because virtually none of these ideas ever really got off the ground or went into production anyway, he was not above sort of cross-pollinating various elements of one treatment into another, one set piece into another where it might fit. But there's basically two concepts that are going into the two movies we're going to be talking about today. One is a project called Emilio and Guloso, which is an idea that he had for a sort of
Huloso.
A sort of more infantile fantasy story about a young boy whose father sells his bull, and he goes into a place called the Valley of the Mists, which is also what it was another. That's another name that the project went under, the Valley of the Mists. He goes into this legendary cursed valley and brings back a Tyrannosaurus Rex in order to trade back for the bull. The T-Rex escapes, goes on a rampage, and it's up to Emilio and Huloso to defeat the monster. The one that's much more directly inspiring the later film, The Valley of Gwangi, which was simply titled Gwangi, that almost actually got produced in the 1940s. There was a completed screenplay for the film that was made in 1942, and I believe that Paramount was going to produce the project before it ultimately fell through, and I'm not sure quite for the reasons why. But it's a very similar project, the idea of cowboys going out into a strange, forbidden valley, discovering dinosaurs, bringing them back to show off in an exhibition or in a circus, and then the creature escapes and goes on a rampage. Obviously, all of these elements very much inspired by King Kong and The Lost World, very much a sort of a repetition of motifs and themes.
And it's effective.
Yeah, I think...
You know, it does it. I think what does it, I don't interrupt you, really, it's just the setting. I mean, the way everything's shot, it almost convinces you that there's a place like that you almost say, okay, we're...
Well, with the Valley of Gwangi, certainly. The Beast of Hollow Mountain, I think that it's interesting that all of the best parts about it don't involve the dinosaur at all.
Right.
And the dinosaur itself doesn't appear until the last half hour of the movie. And we had talked about that, how the movie doesn't very elegantly tie together the central drama of the Beast of Hollow Mountain, rather the human drama with the dinosaur aspect. The dinosaur aspect is kind of shoehorned in.
I'm not sure. Like I said, I remember discussing this with you. Of course, you're more knowledgeable about all this stuff, but in terms of movie making. But to me, and it's one of my favorite movies, even though it's a poorly done animation, if you will, of the stop motion and the things that you pointed out to me, it's one of my favorite things because it's like a Hitchcockian in a way. It's an accident. It's an accident that comes in and then reveals itself. The swamp is drying up. It's drying up so much that now this creature has come out of the swamp. And it just works because it's right at the climax of where you have these competing factions all talking about, they're all fighting for power and over a love of a woman. And then, yet, even then, there's an attempt to try this. It has a Hitchcockian element, and I want to say this again, just like you have in Saboteur, where he tries to save the guy off the Statue of Liberty. Here again, the lead character, Grant, whatever his name is, the good guy, he tries to rescue the guy that's been trying to kill him and drive him out. So and then you see how I'm trying to. So that's why it's one of my favorite.
That's just a thing that happens in the story.
Right.
That's not really about.
I know.
That's not really the style the story is being made in. When you say something like Hitchcockian, people are going to get the impression that there's a sophisticated aesthetic.
No, there's not,
and a good suspension of tension.
I just think that
story.
It's interesting that he tries to save the guy. Maybe the guy isn't even dead. We don't know if he's dead or knocked out, but we'll get into the actual plot of the movie. Anyway, so that's what I think about it. I don't see it as being a shoehorn. That's my personal impression, and maybe other people can comment on if they've ever seen this movie. Go ahead.
Well,
Sorry.
I mean, with The Beast of Hollow Mountain, first of all, this is made in it's made in 1955, released in 1956. This is a film production by a production duo called Edward and William Nassour. And the Nassour brothers were two sort of private businessmen who came to Hollywood in the 1920s, really made most of their money in cosmetics and other related industries, and sort of as a side hustle entered into film production. They opened their own studio, and while the Nassours, especially Edward Nassour, he tried to get various film projects off the ground, for the most part they just ended up leasing out their studio to various independent low-budget film and television production projects. And with Edward Nassour, it's actually very interesting because he was very much inspired by the animators of the 1930s. Like, the first public record I found of Edward Nassour being mentioned in the mainstream press actually comes from a New York Times article from November 7th, 1940, and it's all about how Walter Lantz, the famous Universal Studios animator, the creator of Woody the Woodpecker, etc., how he's attempting to mount a sort of Willis O'Brien-esque fantasy epic project called Lost Atlantis, and the article mentions that the article mentions seeing various stop motion models and small sets made for the thing, because at that point they're still shooting test footage in order to get the approval of the producer of the film, Columbia, to go ahead with the project. I think it's very interesting that they are making this project the Lost Atlantis, and there was also a Willis O'Brien project about Atlantis that also never got off the ground. So like it's one of these weird things where I don't have any evidence that one inspired the other, but it seems awfully uncanny that the first time you hear Edward Nassour being brought up in the press, which is as a sort of animation assistant to Walter Lantz, it's in this frame of reference to something that you could easily tie to Willis O'Brien. This idea that it seems like Willis O'Brien and King Kong in particular were a pretty huge influence on Nassour. And this was relatively late in his life, too. He would have been in his 30s already. He had apparently already been a sort of hobbyist and private, sort of novelty film creator, working in various types of animation, stop motion and replacement animation mainly. But he never really gets his chance to, number one, to make the kinds of movies that he wants to make, but also just to really hone his talents. Because at the end of the day, it's very interesting that The Beast of Hollow Mountain is like one of, I think, 3 or 4 films that the Nassours actually made in their entire period in film production, which lasted from the 30s all the way up to the 60s before Edward Nassour tragically committed suicide. The dude stabbed himself in the heart. I think it was after he found out he had been in sort of ill health, and he was in the midst of producing basically what was going to be his magnum opus. It was going to be a fully animated replacement animation movie, coincidentally enough, about a boy named Emilio and his magic bull and the relationship between them. And he ended up, the impression that I got is that he was diagnosed with cancer, and so he stabbed himself in the heart in 1962 without the film ever being completed. It's just kind of a sad story for the guy, because it seemed like from the very beginning, Nassour was a guy who was clearly enthusiastic about the magic of animation and the power of cinema, but just didn't have the individual discipline and talent to really bring his vision into life the same way that someone like Ray Harryhausen might have. Because I just note that, like, in this article, what Lantz and Nassour are attesting in this article is that they've developed a completely new animation process. Quote, because of the texture of the plastic that the models are made of, and a new registering device which guides and regulates movement, Lantz has secured a satisfactory illusion of lifelike action. According to current plans, he will use the test footage to use in one of his cartoon shorts to find out what the public thinks about it. All the way back in 1940, they're putting forward the idea that they've developed this really novel new animation system. Now, later on, much later, in the mid-50s, here Nassour is no longer working for Lantz. Obviously, he's in his own independent production company. He's in the midst of producing The Beast of Hollow Mountain, which he is producing, directing. He had some influence on the development of the writing of the film, and he is also performing all of the animation on the film himself. Now, here's another interesting quote from a contemporary article before the release of the film and even before the production itself was completed. This is a quote from an April 12th, 1953 New York Times article. Now Nassour is once again claiming he's developed a completely new animation process, and this time he has patented it, and he's referring to it as Regiscope. Quote, The figures are activated by electrical impulses. The figures are made of a pliable material. So once again, you see the reverberation of Number one, the new registering system. This time it's being attributed to electricity. And then the figures are made of a pliable material, which the producer described as being something like plastic. Again, just like in 1940 when him and Lance were claiming that they made their figures out of a new kind of plastic. The exact nature of the material, like details about the electrical animation system, come under heading of my secrets, he added. The Regiscope panel, which might be likened to a control board used in television, feeds electrical impulses to the figures from a pattern of action outlined on a transparent material, which is fed into the Regiscope. He said the process is actually very simple and eliminates more than half of the, quote, painstaking, time-consuming work that is required in the animation of line drawings. He added, we have absolute control of the action of the figures to within 64ths of an inch. Now, here's the thing about this so-called Regiscope thing, and this is something that future film reviewers, even beyond film scholars, like people who are just aficionados of these old monster movies, it is patently obvious that none of the animation that is done in The Beast of Hollow Mountain is achieved through any method that isn't already conventionally available. There's one dinosaur in the movie, and it's basically, when we see it in any sort of significant fashion, it's represented in one of two ways. One, which is actually the rarer way that it's represented, is through standard stop-motion animation. And usually the armature that is used for those stop-motion sequences is only from the lower torso up to the head. So it's not even the full figure, and this is mainly for close-up shots. The vast majority of the animation of the dinosaur is actually not done through stop-motion animation. It's done through a form of animation that's called replacement animation. Now, what's replacement animation? Replacement animation is a style that was actually pioneered by George Pal in the 1930s, back when he was still a British animator and filmmaker before becoming like a huge sort of cinematic wizard in his own right with movies like Conquest of Space and Destination Moon and When Worlds Collide and all these other projects, and War of the Worlds and The Time Machine, obviously. Before that, he was an animator, and he developed and patented a process of replacement animation that he used in his Puppet Tunes series, where, unlike stop-motion animation, where you have the animation of an individual armature, where you put it in a pose, you take one frame of animation, you slightly adjust it, you take another frame, and then when that's shown in a sequence, it creates the illusion of movement. In replacement animation, you actually make an entire spectrum of virtually identical but slightly adjusted separate figures that are still and cannot be adjusted to then be photographed in sequence. Here's the thing, replacement animation can actually be quite beautiful, even if we're going through a purely artistic point of view. If you have an armature, like, say, Willis O'Brien or Ray Harryhausen and Pete Davidson are working with, you are immediately limited necessarily by how much the individual armature can express. Like, the individual armature can't breathe, for instance. You can't, you would have to create a separate model that has, something inside of it that can replicate breathing.
Right.
And it's also a function of the fact that you can have more detail in terms of, inevitably, and you see this with King Kong, and you see it in the Valley of Gwangi when Ray Harryhausen is animating the Eohippus, which is the small prehistoric ancestor of the horse that appears in the film. When you have hair on your model, inevitably, no matter how good the production of the hair itself is, Ray Harryhausen, in fact, developed a process of creating the hair for his models so that they would not be altered as much by contact with the fingertips of the animator. But you see it prominently in King Kong, where it's inevitably your mind registers very minute changes into the hair all over the body of the animated figure that are not consistent from frame to frame, because these are literally the impressions of the fingertips of the animator.
To splotch.
Right.
Yep.
Now, theoretically, replacement animation removes the potential for that type, and it creates more invisibility.
Right. But
but the second aspect of replacement animation is that in another way, and I think the thing that was more attractive about it to Nassour is that it's more cost effective. Even though technically you're producing more models and those in and of themselves are expensive enough to make, once you hone down what it is exactly that you want from an individual shot, once you pin down what the cycle of movement of the animated figure is going to be, it's actually a lot cheaper to just make a bunch of individual models, put one in, take the frame, take that out, replace it with another, take the frame, do that, than it is to spend potentially much longer hours animating an individual model and then potentially having much more room for error. But the problem with that is, and we see it in The Beast of Hollow Mountain with the animation of the dinosaur, is that the replacement animation, because the creature itself is bound to a limited cycle of movements, even if we're not consciously aware of it, our mind unconsciously registers the fact that the animal is behaving in a toyetic, repetitious, and unnatural way that completely removes the more important aspect of animation and the thing that cell animation,
it's the personality of the creature,
personality of the creature, and the performance that the animator imbues
which
into
Harryhausen
the animated
was
model.
just absolutely.
Oh yeah, it's like,
think of all the films he did, like the Medusa and things like that. It's just absolutely remarkable the kind of feeling you get from the creatures that are presented by Harryhausen.
So I think that's it. And again, I think that was a long.
Well, I'm glad you pointed out to me. I didn't even know that. I thought it was all stop action. I didn't realize that was actually.
If that was all stop action, that was pretty terrible stop action. Like, it turns out it's just kind of mediocre replacement animation. Because
now you convinced me. I always wondered why it looked a little bit fuzzy or not to scale. So like the scale.
I mean, like, well, another animator who used replacement animation. Did you ever see the old Paramount Fleischer Studios Superman cartoons from the 1930s?
No.
Well, in those, the Fleischers, they actually did replacement animation. They would mold the individual replacement models and sculptures, but then they would later rotoscope them. So then when you watch these animations from the 1930s Superman serials, they're some of the most dynamic animations that were available at the time, because now the animator is working from the tracing of so much finer and more realistic detail than the sort of like rubber hose animation. It's like that, but that's the thing. Replacement animation has its benefits. Like, the thing that I would compare how Edward Nassour is doing it is, I would compare it more to something like Hanna-Barbera.
Okay.
He has a specific set of cycles that he is using to make the animation more cost effective, which eliminates the expressive quality of it, and which is particularly bad in the context of The Beast of Hollow Mountain, because this is a creature that is supposed to occupy living space. And like even some of the compositing of live action and animation in this is pretty terrible. There is actually a third way that the dinosaur is represented, and this is the worst of all. They have one puppet arm to the T-Rex, and we see, the Allosaurus, and we see it in a scene where it's reaching into the cave after the hero at the climax of the film. Obviously, that looks bad, but what looks even worse is they have boots. They have these dinosaur boots, and it's terrible because there's even this one shot where the Allosaurus is tracking this little Mexican boy who is looking for his father, who has disappeared in the swamp under Hollow Mountain. And so we have a shot of the boy's feet walking in the mud, and then we cut to another shot of the dinosaur's feet treading in the mud. But the problem is that, again, we can tell that the scale is not any different, that this is just the boots of some actor that they're wearing, and we can see that the mud itself,
it's too small.
The mud doesn't look like a huge expanse of mud. It looks like
the physics would dictate that it would be more displacement.
And so we're getting a window here, I think,
Well, that's because you look at it so critically.
Well, no, it's not because. Well, I'm not looking at it critically. What I'm doing is I'm trying to look at this autobiographically.
Yeah.
Because I think at the end of the day, I appreciate that you got more out of the Beast of Hollow Mountain than I did. But
dumb minds find things that are amazing.
I think this is a great way to sort of analyze the way that even a bad filmmaker, their individual idiosyncratic perspective inherently impresses itself on a film in a unique way. And with Edward Nassour, it all comes back to this idea of regiscope. Now, Edward Nassour, and we have it acknowledged by his descendants that he did patent, and there apparently was a regiscope system made, complete with a panel and this sort of registering device for animating figures electronically. But apparently the thing never really worked, which is why it's not used in The Beast of Hollow Mountain, and it wasn't even used when he ended up making Emilio and the Magic Bull. You note from that New York Times article, the emphasis that he makes is on the fact that this is really going to eliminate on the time consumption that it takes to animate.
Right.
And the problem is that obviously Nassour was a guy who really wanted to make animated fantasy movies. He was clearly, like, even in The Beast of Hollow Mountain, there are numerous points in the film that you can point to and say, that is an explicit reference to King Kong. Like, he's clearly inspired by Willis O'Brien beyond simply buying the rights to both Gwangi and the Valley of the Mists and sort of compositing them together in his own original film. You see the clear inspiration and the desire to make these kind of flights of adventure and fantasy. But the problem is that he also has this kind of bizarre obsession with making the process less expensive and less time consuming.
So he can have his artistic expression. I don't think he deliberately wanted it to be cheaper. I think he thought that this would really pan out, save time, and be able to generate his artistic expression in the movies. Is that what you're thinking, or no?
Well, I think that's part of it, but I think also I think again it speaks to something. I think it speaks to something a little bit more tragic about his pathology, which is that he wants to create these beautiful films, but he doesn't perceive that this thing that he has devoted so much of his life to creating and patenting, regiscope.
Right.
It's a distraction from the discipline that is necessary to animate something realistically.
Do we get any insight of how other animators reacted to it? Do we get an idea of how O'Brien or Harryhausen reacted to this movie?
I don't think we know for certain. I mean, I can't imagine that Willis O'Brien was very happy with it because I'm sorry, it needs to be said. Like, the animation in The Beast of Hollow Mountain is awful. And I don't think, and that's the thing is that, again, like, I don't think Willis O'Brien would only object to the film based on its special effects, which are bad. I think he would object to the extent to which, again, Nassour, in the development of this film, like the actual screenwriter of it is a guy named Robert Hill, who was more or less brought on to basically just take all of the various extraneous ideas from Valley of the Mists and Gwangi and try to fashion them into something new and up to date. I think O'Brien, more than anything, would also object to the plotting of the film and the extent to which there seems to be no thematic relationship between the fantasy element of the story, the premise of going into this unknown world, this place where the laws of reality are suspended, and the more sort of concrete human drama. Because what do we have in The Beast of Hollow Mountain? We have more or less the story of a Texas rancher living in a small Mexican town who is
Jimmy Ryan.
Jimmy Ryan, played by Guy Madison.
Right.
He's this small rancher. He's got a friend named Felipe, played by Carlos Rivas, who is his partner. And basically, despite the fact that basically it seems like everyone else in the town likes him, he runs afoul with a guy named Enrique Rios, played by Eduardo Noriega. And the thing about it is that Eduardo doesn't like Jimmy, apparently just because he's xenophobic. Apparently he just doesn't like this American.
Americana, right.
Yeah, well, more importantly, he's an American. He's a gringo who's coming down, and he's actually undercutting him financially because he's willing to, as Jimmy proudly says it, I sell the bulls that the cattle we're raising at the government price. If you want to, it's like, you can't accuse me of undercutting you. Enrique is also offended because it's clear that there's sort of a sexual chemistry that is budding between Jimmy and Enrique and Enrique's fiancée, Sarita, played by Patricia Medina.
Right. The performances were halfway decent, I believe. And
the performances are halfway decent. And here's the thing. The production of the film is relatively high for its budget.
Yeah.
I think part of the reason is because rather than filming in Southern California, they actually filmed on location in Mexico.
I think it's beautiful. I mean, and there's a deliberate attempt to get the background. Even when they're having discussions between people, they try to get the background in every shot. And that's why I guess that's why I appreciate the film. Go ahead.
Well,
I want to listen to your story.
There's an almost travel log-like naturalism to it.
There is. You're right.
There's a authentic interest in the setting.
Like you read on the plane going to somewhere. You read one of those travel magazines.
like obviously there are, obviously there are various kinds of there's kind of problematic stereotypes in some ways. In particular, there's a drunk character named Pancho who is sort of like a stereotypical drunk Mexican. Panchito is his son, played by Mario Navarro, who is basically the annoying child actor who they have to sort of easily squeeze sympathy out of the spectator. And the thing that I found particularly rich, which is, obviously the idea of Enrique Rios as he's not a mustache twirling villain by any respects. He's actually kind of portrayed relatively complexly because he's obviously corrupt.
He's Machiavellian.
Right, exactly. It's like, it's like he maybe has a bit of a narcissistic streak, but it's clear that but anyway, there's clearly a sort of nativism that is behind his treatment of Jimmy Ryan. And I just had to think, all right, it's kind of all the premises for a Western, the idea of framing a conflict between a Texas settler on Mexican soil and framing it from the perspective of, it's actually the Mexican who is intolerant of the Texan. And it's I
believe that's true. I think for the richer people that were in Mexico at the time, that was the feeling. What I do like about the film is and you mentioned this before when we were looking at it, is the large number of actual Mexicans in the movie. I mean, in terms of actual
just
roles.
Extras.
But it's amazing. I mean, really, and even I imagine Nassour himself, right? I imagine they employ so many of them. And the actors are all...
There were actually a relatively large number of American films being shot in Mexico during this time. For whatever reason, you see in the early to mid 50s a kind of uptick in movies that are kind of exploiting American interest in Mexico and in South America and more importantly in the Latin American community that's living in America. And
this is south of the Rio Grande, isn't that how it opens?
You're thinking of the Valley of Gwangi.
Oh,
but
sorry.
I think we can assume it's south of the Rio Grande. And again, this is the reason why I consider it kind of rich, because there's clearly a certain element to it that is sort of born out of kind of Alamo-esque fantasy, where it's we were just intrepid individualists, and the goddamn tyrannical old money Mexicans just didn't want the white settlers to settle. And it's no, you freaking occupied land that you weren't supposed to, and then when Mexico abolished slavery, you fought a war over it. That's what happened. But the thing that's interesting about this film is that technically Nassour co-directs it with a guy named Ismael Rodriguez, and the film is actually technically a full American-Mexican co-production. It's co-produced by Rodriguez's own production company, Películas Rodriguez. And with the exception of Patricia Medina, virtually all the other supporting cast of the film are individuals who had careers in Mexican cinema. And this is a film that was shot simultaneously in English and in Spanish. So they would shoot a scene in English, then they would shoot the scene in Spanish, ostensibly directed by Rodriguez. it turns out Ismael Rodriguez is actually like a really big name in Mexican film history. Like, he's very much considered to be like one of the top Mexican filmmakers. Like, he had one of his films was nominated for a Golden Globe for Best Foreign Language Film. Another of his films was nominated at the Oscars for the Best Foreign Language. You know, like, it's very interesting that this movie, that from the American perspective, is being made by a guy who basically never made anything of merit. Not like this was something of merit, but like never made anything of merit again. Whereas the actual Mexicans involved in the production of the film, from the Mexican perspective, these were like actual like big name performers and filmmakers, and they're shooting in, you know, and from their perspective, they're shooting in this movie that's being done in full color deluxe and CinemaScope, and it's this big.
It is
fantasy.
brilliant color. I mean, the colors are beautiful, right?
And
except for the animation.
I mean, and that's what I have to say. I think The Beast of Hollow Mountain, like, the parts of it that are good are just kind of like the soap opera aspects of it. They're sort of the classical, like, sort of Latin melodrama.
Right,
like,
right,
you know,
right.
It's like you have all the right pieces. You have the jealous rich husband who's connected to a world of sort of seedy crime and corruption. You have the intrepid hero. You have the chaste woman who is torn between the world that she knows and the sort of exotic tastes of the foreign. You know, it's like I think those things, weirdly enough, work relatively well strictly on the basis of the strength of the performances and what I am going to chalk up to Rodriguez's own direction and his own sort of natural finesse in portraying this kind of melodrama. That's the thing. The main conflict of this movie boils down to the economic and the romantic rivalry between Jimmy and Enrique.
Right.
The monster doesn't enter into it except as a kind of just a last, during the last act of the film. Weirdly enough, just as something that sort of comes in, because basically, Enrique's dastardly plan is that Jimmy ultimately decides to leave because Enrique is able to sort of rally his connections to just freeze Jimmy out of the market completely. He can't get any loans. He can't sell anything. He can't buy anything in the town.
Right.
So Jimmy, in order to allow Felipe to thrive on the ranch, he's going to let Felipe take the ranch, and he's just going to pull up stakes and go back to Texas. But before they do that, they still have the one last cattle drive to sell all of their cattle to the market. And so Enrique's plan is that he's going to take two of his...
Sabotage that.
Yeah, he's going to sabotage that by starting a stampede. And then he's going to take his own cattle to the same train station and say, well, if you're coming here for an order and you can't leave without one, I have all these ones ready.
We'll take extra 15% on it.
Yeah, he's going to cut him out of it. But basically, all that happens is the Allosaurus just shows up out of nowhere, starts the stampede too early,
right?
And
in
so
the wrong
then
direction.
and so then the cattle runs into town, and then one of Enrique's henchmen accidentally lets it slip when he's telling him,
Told you it was too dangerous.
Again, it just doesn't have anything to do with anything.
I don't know. Like I said, I think it's sort of like, I just find it interesting that they drop. I think you're right. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you, but it works for some reason, at least for my feeble brain, that it just works. I just like this sudden, you wait to the end. I remember as a kid, I didn't appreciate that much because you didn't get any monsters until the end. And then...
Yeah, the kid version of you was right.
Right, maybe simplicity of the mind. But the point is, maybe even more simple. But the point is that there's something about that sudden. It's not a Deus ex machina, but it's something that crystallizes and brings to a head what would normally have been. They causes the stampede. Jimmy gets cut out. The guy takes the thing, and it's the end of the movie. Or they have a fight or something.
Well, it's not Deus ex machina. It's machina ex machina.
Right.
It's just
the point is that I don't agree. I think we need to have your listeners or your podcast listeners to weigh in on this. I think there's something magical. Not magical is the wrong word.
Well, it seems like the main purpose that the dinosaur serves is really just like, I mean, I guess it is kind of a Deus Ex Machina in the sense that it's literally there to just punish evil. It literally only enters into the plot really in any credible way in order to spoil Enrique's plan. Then Jimmy fights the dinosaur and successfully gets it to fall into the tricks it to falling into the quicksand.
All poorly done, but
it's all terrible, but like,
well, there's the good scene about. I think the abandoned house scene was pretty cool.
Look, I get what you're saying.
How did he do the one where he runs around the? That's done stop action.
No,
correct?
that's replacement.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Jesus, that's terrible.
Well, that's why it looks like a wind-up toy. Like, again, the sense of scale, like, the monster looks so toyetic. But look, I think I understand what you're saying from the perspective of that there's kind of a magical, realist quality to it. Because we get one of the hallmarks of the worst examples of these kinds of movies where we have a long narration at the beginning of the film explaining the background.
Which you should never do.
There's a legend of a demon monster that lives in Hollow Mountain that only comes out during the dry season in order to feast on.
Which is not even necessary because that's that.
Right, that's what's about to happen.
It's all revealed in the movie.
But I mean, I guess like that's the thing is that like I can understand it from the perspective that to a certain extent that the Allosaurus is literally supposed to be like a demon. It's literally supposed to be a kind of
in Gwangi it's the same thing.
Well, yeah, it's a sort of totemic figure.
Yes, right.
Like it's not and we saw this again with Kaltiki the immortal monster. It's not a question of whether the science explanation is correct or the magical explanation is correct. It's a matter of they're obverse of the same thing. They're both inadequate explanations of a phenomenon we can't
Here's
really
another
understand.
example, Beast of Haunted Cave. It's very similarly, the beast is awakened, there's a cracked egg in a cave, and it's really about a gangster trying to take over.
I think the difference with the Beast of Haunted Cave, which we haven't covered on this podcast, but I think if people watch the Beast from Haunted Cave, I think the difference there is that despite the fact that it's also kind of a crappy movie, it's that you at least have a sufficient build up of the sort of tension of the idea of sin. There's sort of like this element of the Beast from Haunted Cave where there's this sense of a logical progression where you begin in the natural world, you have these characters encounter these criminals, and then there's this constant progression of the plot forward in which you are slowly drawn further and further into this world of sin and of crime. And so once they reach the haunted cave, there is kind of like a surrealistic element where it's almost like the monster itself like represents like a sort of magical justice.
But I'm trying to say is that
with the Beast of Hollow Mountain, the problem is that there isn't really a logical progression of what is happening in the melodrama of the story with what's happening with the dinosaur. The dinosaur just sort of appears.
I know, but like the dinosaur, the Beast of Hollow Mountain, Beast of the Haunted Cave, doesn't pick any winners or losers. He kills everybody, and so is the dinosaur. Dinosaur doesn't care whether you're a good guy or bad guy.
Well, yeah, it's about breaking the taboos.
And the other thing is that again, Jimmy tries to save the guy. He warns him to get the hell out of the way when the dinosaur actually then
the toy comes after
him. And he tries to save him. I mean, so that's what I mean about the human element.
But he does leave him in the cave, and you're right.
Well,
we don't get any confirmation of whether or not he's alive or dead, which in the sort of moral dualism of the movie, it basically means it doesn't matter. It's it's like he's been consumed in the same way that the dinosaur has been consumed by the swamp,
he's been
or
defeated. I think the idea is that it comes to a head because already who's the guy that plays the father? Julio Villarreal plays Don Pedro. He talks to Don Pedro. Said, "I told
the sort of patriarch of the town and the father of Sarita." Yes.
Right, and he's actually on Enrique's side. right? He doesn't want the gringo.
Well, he's on neither of their sides. Like, he
But he's-
respects Jimmy, but he has his
But he wants Jimmy to go too.
But yeah, he's sort of, well, he's
Right.
like a sort of, he's like, he's like the Lord.
Right.
He's got to, make decisions he's got to make political decisions of convenience that.
Right, but the point is, what I'm trying to make, the fact that you're spending time, you and I are spending time about all these elements, or maybe it's just me raising them within your...
Yeah,
is,
exactly.
Is the point about the richness of the movie. I'm just saying...
Well, we're spending time talking about them because we weren't distracted enough by good storytelling. Like, it's like, and again, it's like, I'm not, and this is the thing, that's the thing, I opened it by emphasizing that I thought the melodramatic aspects of it were the more interesting thing.
Yeah,
It's
you're
the
right.
part where the dinosaur
Right.
is shoehorned in that it kind of destroys what could have very easily been just
A Western.
it would have been just a melodramatic romantic story, which is fine. Like,
Right.
I don't think it would have been masterpiece theater or anything.
It'd be
but
like
again,
The Big Country, right?
yeah,
Like-
but it would also but what do we have then? Enrique is defeated and Jimmy is welcomed back by Don Pedro, and then they sign the North American Free Trade Agreement. So Jimmy and his descendants will prosper as the new, and he and Don
Right.
Pedro will prosper as the new
All right.
new landed class of North America.
What else do you want to say about this?
Nothing.
Oh. All right, yeah, this is my listeners. This is Rocco talking, obviously. If you
The
should...
political views expressed by Ian on this podcast are not necessarily the opinion of all participants.
Or listeners. I think it's good. I wish people would watch it and they just, let me tell.
It's weird.
Yeah.
At least it's weird.
Yeah.
It's like,
Good. Let's go on to the better film. Which I
Yes.
think, yeah.
Okay. Valley of Gwangi. One of my personal favorites by Ray Harryhausen.
Just gorgeous.
Gorgeously
Harryhausen shines in this movie.
gorgeously shot, beautiful animation.
Oh my god! And the melding of live people and the models together.
Well, the thorough integration
Yeah, thorough,
of the
that's what I
human
meant.
drama
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the sort of parallel fantasy drama, which you don't even really realize is happening until the climax of the movie, where, again, like King Kong, it isn't until the climax of the movie you realize that there's an entire parallel, paradramatic story going on that isn't explicitly expressed, where you are identifying with the story through the perspective of the monster.
Right.
But I think I do
I
want
really
to,
felt bad about the ending. You talk about animal
because
cruelty,
he's even, yeah.
and the kid's crying at the end. It's hard to tell why the kid is crying.
Yeah, we get another
Mexican.
Mexican.
We're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
I want to hear what you have to say.
Well,
about
I
it. Go
wanted
ahead.
to open this up
Good.
by there's this great book by a guy named, this art historian named W.J.T. Mitchell, called The Last Dinosaur Book. And it's basically a cultural history of representations of dinosaurs, both in museum and in popular art context. And it sort of traces the history of dinosaur representation and tries to tease out in various kinds of psychoanalytical and historical interpretations of exactly what we sort of alluded to with the Beast of Hollow Mountain, this idea that the dinosaur is kind of a totemic figure within a specific culture. And within American culture, the dinosaur harbors connotations that we sort of understand on like an intuitive collective level. And one thing that he notes, he's not actually talking about Valley of Gwangi or the Beast of Hollow Mountain. What he's talking about is a short story by Sharon Farber from 1988 called The Last Thunder Horse West of the Mississippi. And there's an accompanying illustration for the story by the painter Bob Walters, which shows this sauropod, this long-necked dinosaur rearing on its hind legs, like dust all around it, and there's these two cowboys with their pistols drawn, ready to sort of, attack and try to lasso the creature. And the thing that Mitchell writes, and I think this is a very astute observation, one might expect that an image of a dinosaur with cowboys would have a surrealistic weirdness, but the surprise is how natural it looks. And I think that's the thing. You see a little bit of it in the Beast of Hollow Mountain, but you really see it expressed quite clearly in the Valley of Gwangi. There is something so
Natural
uncannily natural
Right.
about putting cowboys
like
and
Flintstones.
dinosaurs together.
Yeah.
But even with
I
the
know.
Flintstones, I know what you
making
mean.
a joke.
Exactly.
Yeah,
The Flintstones.
yeah.
It's a living.
No, but
Yeah.
but you're right. I mean, go ahead. I don't want to step on what you're saying. Go ahead.
so
But it does feel natural. Is the point in which you're saying? Yes, I agree.
Well, I think it understanding it in a certain way is that the collision of cowboys and dinosaurs, it's appropriate because to a certain extent in North America, the idea of the American frontier and the practice of paleontology, which again, obviously there's a scientific perspective to paleontology, which is that you're just studying prehistoric bones and trying to create a history of the world. But in more cultural terms, when we go to museums, when we go to exhibits, we're not just going to learn about dinosaurs. What is a common refrain that you always hear in even the most educational videos about dinosaurs, even in Discovery Channel?
Size and
just it's stuff about size. Size is
Right.
also very important.
teeth. Right.
Ferocity, their sort of extinctness is another thing.
Right.
But one thing that is constantly brought up, at least in terms of representation, with the arrangement of fossils in a museum, is the idea of bringing them back to life. There's this theme of kind of resurrection, of extracting
Yes.
something from the ground and making it
right.
to thrive.
That's a human condition, right?
Well-
Otherwise, we have a series of bones just lying out, and they're plaster, and say, "Okay, people enjoy this."
Well,
It really is not
no,
that
well,
inspiring.
well,
It's like looking
nah.
at Lucy halfway lying down.
There's
I mean, you do it to
but-
fully good.
But even that is sort of kind of belying the more totem.
There's no skin on them.
Even that is kind of belying the more totemic significance of the dinosaurs and big prehistoric animals themselves. Because the thing is that they're at least in North America, despite the fact that the very beginnings of dinosaur study in Western Europe, there's always been this sort of connotations of reconstruction and resurrection. The thing about it is that in North America, the sort of study of the natural sciences, including paleontology, is so much tied to the mythology of manifest destiny. One of the earliest proponents of paleontology in the United States was Thomas Jefferson. Because you have to understand that, even though paleontology was a form of study that was originated in France and was really pioneered in terms of the idea of reconstructing prehistoric animals and trying to reconstruct prehistoric life in Great Britain. Particularly, I'm thinking of Richard Owen and Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins's iguanodon sculpture that they premiered in 1854,
Right.
which was literally like this big concrete and iron
Right.
quadrupedal sculpture.
And
that
they ate inside.
Yeah, you go inside and you dine
Have
inside the
right.
dinosaur.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it was wrong because the nose thing, the nose spike was actually
Well,
the
it was
thumb spike.
quadrupedal, and
Right,
it was
right.
it
So they had it
drug
all
its tail.
wrong, but that's
well,
real,
it looked
yeah.
like an iguana,
Right.
You know, it's like, but like the thing is that, like, you know, there you see an explicit example of how the dinosaur represents a kind of totemic collective identity, because it's not just about seeing the dinosaur, it's about like going inside of it.
Right.
And inhabiting it. And like, even when they premiered the sculpture, they even like played a song in which they were like comparing the bones of the iguanodon to like Adam's rib and all these other things. Like, you know,
So there's almost like a homage, right? Or,
yeah.
right.
Well, it's almost like they're treating the dinosaur, and this is something that Mitchell refers to. It's almost like they're treating the dinosaurs themselves as the ancestors of the people, of the human beings who live on the continent. Like, and the quote he uses is that the Victorian dinosaurs declare the power of the nation state as deeply rooted in the natural antiquities buried in British soil. At the same time, the temporal and spatial reach of these creatures makes them apt symbols of imperial sway. So, like, that's the
Yes,
thing. Like, that's
I
the thing
agree.
about the size and the ferocity,
Right.
and the way in which they are represented. Like, again, the iguanodon, it's not just that the iguanodon is this big, bulky, concrete and iron thing. It's that it's this thing you can go inside of. Oh, it's like a trolley. It's like a train. It's like there's this whole mechanical association with it. This idea that the monster itself is almost like a deific ancestor of the technology that we are creating. This idea that they ruled the world that they knew, and now we have taken their place, and we are ascending to, you know,
Right.
with
the
with
investment in it,
yeah, with the power of our minds, we are ascending to the
which is very
dominion.
Western, isn't it?
Oh yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I agree with that. If you look at any of the paleontologists or paleoanthropologists, they look like Westerners. They wear a Western hat.
They look like old prospectors.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, and that's the thing.
They
is-
have that feel to, and they have that same kind of drive. I mean, you're absolutely right. They're crazy.
And that's the
They're
thing.
crazy.
That's something that Mitchell also notes, is that again, that is so much tied to the specific American character of paleontology, because, you know, the thing about it is that
But it's not just American. For example, even in Ethiopia, the pride they take of finding the first humans has that
there's
same
always
kind of impact. It's like, it's our cultural identity. It's
it's their history. It's like,
Yeah.
but you see the same thing in China, like the amount of like the you know, there's a great propaganda boon that's to be gained when you discover, like, if Russia discovers a mammoth encased in
Yes.
ice, it's like, oh boy, wait till we show, like, you know, it's like there's like a science race just as much as there's an arms
There
race.
absolutely is a science race, and it's very bitter.
But here's the thing about
Very bitter race.
But here's the thing about the American relationship with the dinosaur, and the thing that makes it different. The thing that makes it different is that the British Isles, at the very least, anything that is discovered there is native soil. In China, indigenous people of China are discovering things that are native to their soil. Same thing with Ethiopia. The United States is colonized settler land, and literally up until the early 19th century, it was kind of like a common stereotype of Western Europe that not only were Americans kind of a backward and underdeveloped culture, but it literally extended to conceptions of the land itself. The idea that the land is just not rich in life, it's not hospitable to the development of organic variety and richness. And so for Thomas Jefferson, his investment in the natural sciences, you know, it turned out to be so much more emphatic from an American perspective, because, you know, partially because of the sheer breadth of the continent that is left to the unsettled whites. You know, partially it's just the volume of the fossil evidence that's available, but mostly it's coming from a much more deep-seated investment in cultivating a narrative of our natural destiny in the aftermath of a political revolution.
Right.
We are settlers here. So by cataloging everything, by spreading ourselves out across the continent, by digging deep into the soil and whether it's cultivating the land in terms of farms or agriculture, or it's extracting oil, or the creation of iron, or in taking fossils out of the ground.
Right.
It's part of this indigenating process.
Indigenating and then expunging.
And obviously, yes, the expunging of the people who were always there.
Or whatever. Or the whole sentiment of what it means to be in North America.
Yeah.
I agree. I agree with that.
Yeah. And so, and that's the thing, is that, to the extent that there's always this connection between the paleontology in the U.S. and Manifest Destiny, it's interesting that, some of the earliest paleontologists, someone like O.C. Marsh, he's not just a scientist at all. He is a shameless self-promoter and an entrepreneur, and this guy who cultivates this mythology of what a good marksman he is, about how he's a real rugged frontiersman. And here's the interesting thing, part of the reason that the original sort of dino mania that swept America sort of tapered off, it was specifically because the scientific community kind of became embarrassed by paleontology. Because number one, there's a lot.
I agree with that.
Because number one, there's this perspective that it's just kind of frivolous and stupid. It's you're just digging up dead bones. You don't even really know how they fit together. You're kind of doing a lot of conjecture and guesswork, and also it's useless. What vaccines are you creating? What advancements are you making into knowledge? But it's also the idea that there's this circus to it.
Yes.
People like O.C. Marsh, who are just these absolutely shameless, they're building up a whole legend of themselves as rugged frontiersmen, because there's clearly an ideological trajectory to this. This isn't about educating people. This is about mystifying and entertaining the masses in a kind of lowest common denominator way. And so how does this relate to the Valley of Gwangi? Well, I just think it's interesting that, the Valley of Gwangi is not just a movie about cowboys encountering dinosaurs. It's about, number one, it's not even really about cowboys. It's about characters who play cowboys in a circus. And I think that's a thing that needs to be mentioned. But it's also, it explicitly acknowledges paleontology. There's a paleontologist character. And the thing that's really fascinating is that when we have, in the scene where our main sort of rugged frontiersman character, Tuck Kirby, played by James Franciscus, and our Professor Bromley, the paleontologist, played by Lawrence Naismith,
who happens to be English.
Yeah. There's this great scene where they're looking at the Neohippus, which is this miniature prehistoric antecedent of the horse that they've discovered living in this Mexican valley. And you see them both talking about the great potential, and you see the paleontologist thinking of all of the great museums and the great scientific societies that he could be welcomed into because of this great discovery. And what is overlapping with that is Tuck Kirby talking about Barnum and Bailey, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show.
Mm-hmm.
If I can prove that this is the genuine article, I shall undoubtedly receive a knighthood, Mr. Kirby, for the greatest scientific discovery of the age.
The greatest scientific discovery of the age?
Sir Horace Bromley.
It'll look great in lights.
Galileo, Newton,
Buffalo
Darwin,
Bill,
Bromley.
Barnum and Bailey.
Bromley.
Or the Ringling Brothers.
Galileo,
Yes, we'll play one off against the other. Sell to the highest bidder, make them bake.
Possibly Lord.
We'd make a killing.
It's wonderfully poetic because in this overlapping of themes, you actually get a kind of unconscious recognition of the natural symmetry between the history of paleontology and the history of conceptions of the West.
Right.
Because that's the thing is like, the cowboy itself, this, even when we're seeing in the beginning of the movie, when the Wild West show comes into town, they go into the arena, they have the people dressed as the Indians run around in a circle, they shoot it out with the guys dressed as cowboys.
The opening act, yes.
They light the open wagon on fire. This is as much a kind of reconstruction and a conjectural resurrection of a mythic past in the same way that the dinosaurs are a resurrection of the same thing.
Yep. Yeah, I just like it. I just like the idea that they're not really... They're Western, sort of, but they're really just hucksters, right? So even
Tuck Kirby, like the whole implication is that Tuck Kirby is like coming into town because he's trying to convince his former lover T.J. Breckenridge, played by Gila Golan. Tuck Kirby is kind of like a con artist. Yeah, an opportunist. Yeah, that's the right word for it, because he comes in and he wants T.J. Breckenridge, she's the centerpiece of the show, and what that means is because these were very boring times, so the centerpiece of the show is that she takes a horse on her platform and she rides it through a hoop of fire into a tub of a big vat of dirty water. That's the centerpiece of the show, and he wants her to sell the horse to to Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And, you're right. And and again, it goes back to what we're saying is that there really aren't any cowboys in the movie. There are people who play cowboys, which is this wonder sort of metatextual layer to it. It's that this is a movie about people who are performers, and there's all this affectation, but also it's the way the movie opens up, somewhere south, like you mentioned before, the title card just reads somewhere south of the Rio Grande at the turn of the century. Right. So what are we to make of turn of the century? Despite the fact that we see these happy circus performers coming into town, the thing that I am thinking is, oh, this is almost like a trail of extinction. These are people just marching off further down south into the desert, just trying to plumb a trade and a living off of just ignorant boobs who are just turning out and just sort of watching with their, their slack-jawed, surviving off of these pittances.
Right.
But there's no future for them. This is really this turn of the century. It's they're marching off into history. They're just carrying this myth along with them, but it's slowly going to become irrelevant. They're literally going the way of the dinosaurs, which is to say the way that they're traveling is bringing them closer and closer to the Valley of the Dinosaurs.
It's rapine and pillage. I mean, the idea is that even the whole concept is that they're going to go to Wyoming and buy a ranch together.
Yeah.
After they're done exploiting everything here.
Yeah, Tuck and TJ,
it works though.
Yeah, that's the thing is that even when Tuck and TJ have that moment, of course, there's this sort of on again, off again quality to their relationship.
Probably they knew each other. She was upset that he left her, and there's no,
and he's sort of fighting oh, do I really want her back, or do I want to keep my independence?
Really well done. James Franciscus does a really good job of this. In playing a real asshole. I mean, I hate to say it.
And it kind of makes his change of heart hard to stomach. And but here's
it happens too quickly, and it isn't quite so smooth.
It's not sincere. But here's the thing. I'm wondering if we're supposed to sort of interpret it as being kind of ambivalent. Because, even in that scene where Tuck is basically kind of inelegantly... there's this scene where, we'll
go together, we'll get a ranch and race horses, and says, and children? And he has to pause there a minute and think, yeah, and kids too. We can.
Yeah, he's making it. Yeah, he's making it up as he goes along. And even if you watch Gila Galan's performance in the scene, she doesn't really even seem too sure about it. It's not, but not even. I don't think that she doesn't buy it. She's wondering if that's what she wants.
Right.
There's this sort of element to it where it's the only options that these people have is to, what they have now is precarity, but they also have their independence.
Right.
They also have the ability to live these free lives. And so the idea of going back to Wyoming and getting a regular ranch and settling down and
Right,
having
just thinking,
children.
what?
It's like unnatural. It's
Sure.
like, and what is it like? It's like, what do career bachelors always compare it to? It's like putting an animal in a cage.
Right.
And what is the story of the
About
Valley of
putting it-
Gwangi about? It is about putting an animal in a cage. They try to domestic, that's again, it's like you see, again, I don't even think the filmmakers did this consciously. I just think it's a wonderful, it's expressive of the extent to which that Ray Harryhausen as the animator, and obviously he didn't write the screenplay, but he was intimately involved in the development of the project.
Had to be.
The guy he worked with to produce it, Charles H. Schneer, he and Ray Harryhausen co-produced virtually everything that the guy worked upon. He really was like an auteur of animation who was intimately involved in the stories of these films. He was also, not for nothing, a protege of Willis O'Brien. And this is the complete opposite of someone like Edward Nassour, who was always trying to find the shortcut and was always trying to emulate, but didn't have the discipline. And more importantly, wasn't really paying attention in a visceral way to the importance of things like what we see in the Valley of Gwangi. This extent to which it does seem like these characters are being like it does seem like, just like with King Kong, where there's this kind of dual structure to the movie where we see Fay Ray get captured by Kong, and then Kong trades places with her and is destroyed by civilization. We see the same thing in the Valley of Gwangi, where there's this extent to which that, again, going back to that intimate relation between manifest destiny and the sort of totemic significance of the dinosaur, the dinosaurs in this valley and Gwangi itself, they sort of represent like the kind of savage but noble, the very appropriate noble savage kind of imagery. They represent a kind of noble savagery endemic to human beings that is constantly under threat of extinction on the one hand, because it's naturally going to reach a point where it can't sustain itself. It's just going to walk off into the desert because it can't adapt. But it's threatened on the other side by the thing that's going to kill it spiritually. The domesticity, the putting of it in a cage, which is exactly what happens to Gwangi. And you're absolutely right. The end of the movie is the characters, they trap Gwangi after it escapes from the rodeo, and the church is burning. It gets trapped in a church. They burn the church down. The monster dies inside. And it's interesting because they do linger on the face of the child actor, Carlos, played by Gustavo Rojo. Or is that Lope? I forget. But anyway, like they do linger on the face of the actor, the child actor, and the child actor is crying. And it's weird because I don't think it quite works, because we don't really get a sense of
what he's crying about, right?
But here's the thing is that, like, I think we know what he's crying about if we think of it from the perspective of a kid. And it's something we've talked about a million times before, whether it's with Frankenstein or with King Kong. Kids naturally identify with the monster because they understand on an intuitive level that the monster is innocent. And so you have this very strange poetic ambivalence to the Valley of Gwangi, where the monster is destroyed, but you understand that this isn't a happy ending.
No, it's not.
That this is like this is confirmation that the only fate that awaits the truly free and natural thing is destruction.
I think it's interesting that the animal dies in the church.
That's a bit on the nose. Like again, like surrounded by fire,
right? I mean,
ignited by a man. Yeah,
it's really interesting that the whole design of the film is just wonderful. I mean, you have to put the complication that the T.J. Breckenridge finding that she has money now, and also she feels that she doesn't want to get the ranch, so the tables turn.
Well, they do have this interesting thing where, like,
James Francisca's character, Tuck Kirby, initially is pretty aloof and not understanding anything about domesticity. And Golan is the Breckenridge wants, then all of a sudden now she has money and has this hippus.
Yeah, because they have the Gwangi. Yeah.
Well, they don't have Gwangi yet, do they? Or what do they? I can't remember.
Oh, well, she initially has the neo-hippus, but then, like, what ends up happening is that, like, there's this whole thing where a group of gypsies...
Right, to get rid of the curse.
Well, actually, the paleontologist tips them off of where they can find the neo-hippus.
So he can find more things, right?
Yes,
right.
so he can follow them back to the Valley of Gwangi, where they release the
Which
neo-hippus.
is interesting,
Because there's a taboo, like, again, just like in The Beast of Hollow Mountain, there's this kind of, like, indigenous... gypsy taboo that is associated with the mountain and with the valley, but you're right. There's this extent to which where it's like, it's like she's confident that she's going to have this thing that is really going to be, the money maker for all of them, and they're never going to have to worry about anything in their entire lives. Like We're in the Money starts playing, but. The thing about it is that I think is interesting is that once they go to the valley, we have that, she and Tuck basically kind of, have that kind of ambivalent, well, we'll settle down. But then they capture Gwangi, and for a minute it seems like Tuck is ready to leave because he's like, well, you've got everything you wanted. Like, you don't need me.
Right.
Like, I'm just going to be holding you back. And there's this wonderful, like, weird, like, and again, it's like the vast majority of the film is not very, like, nuanced or aesthetically challenging just in strict terms of how it's staged.
No.
But there is that interesting moment where TJ goes running after him and she meets him in the middle of the square.
You can't see anything.
Well, you can't hear anything.
Right.
And then the camera zooms out so that it's just them alone in the center of the square. So you don't know what's being said between them. You don't know what promises has been made.
Right.
But then that's such an interesting thing because at that moment when that camera is zooming out from the human action, suddenly all of the dramatic focus just falls on Gwangi.
Right.
Gwangi is center stage. Like, it's so brilliant and morbid because they have Gwangi in the center of this arena. He's in a big cage behind a big red tarp that's being held by a hot air balloon. One of the gypsies goes in and unlocks the cage, and you hear him scream because Gwangi gets him, and everyone is looking around like, what the hell is that noise? It's so great because the tarp comes up, and and so it's all of these breathless spectators looking on. But then the tenor just changes because you still have the marching band playing this great triumphalist tune. And then there's just like a monster with a guy in the jaws of its mouth. And everyone is just horrified. And the band leader doesn't realize what's happening until he turns around and sees like, oh, dude, and they completely cut the music. It's like, again, like the entire, like, it's kind of amazing how much just the entire tone of the movie just goes to such a dark, even kind of like...
out of control.
Not even just out of control, but like an almost like satanic place.
Right.
Like, it's just like it's like the imagery of the church that's on fire. And almost like as if, so is like Gwangi like a fallen angel? Is he like the Lucifer? Is this like better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven sort of imagery? Like,
I just thought it was interesting to have it in that image. So, it's just, but the other thing you have to comment on is just the continuous stop action when available, the continuous stop action with the live people, even underneath the pterodactyl's wing, the kid that's under the pterodactyl's wing who gets taken. It's absolutely breathtaking. And everything's to scale. You can almost think that the kid's being picked up by a
this was
everything's done perfectly.
This was definitely Harryhausen at the top of his game. And the thing about Harryhausen is that, like, he was a guy who didn't simply learn from Willis O'Brien. He expanded upon all of the potential of the animation. Because what you see...
He advanced it.
Yeah, he advanced it. Like, basically, he developed his own animation technique, unlike Edward Nassour, who basically bluffed his way into pretending he had developed his own animation technique. Ray Harryhausen actually did develop his own unique techniques, and what he called it was called dynamation, where he conceived of the idea of, in order to thoroughly integrate a animated figure into a live action space, he used a combination of rear projected film of the live action scene for a background that he would cycle through simultaneously with animating the stop action figure, as well as the using a foreground glass mat where the part of the image that would be masked off at the bottom is where you could put in foreground camera elements. And you see it, and it's very interesting because the way he sort of pioneers it is in stuff like It Came From Beneath the Sea or 20 Million Miles to Earth, where you see, but those are contexts where you see the monster in like a big city. So you can have like a background element of sky, you can have buildings and cars in the foreground and people and stuff, and you just put the monster in the middle. With the Valley of Gwangi, it's very interesting because for the most part, it's just like a monster in like a big flat valley, and so it's really kind of exquisitely done how much it's able to preserve this sense of depth,
Yes.
and the sense to which that the actual human beings are interacting with this animal that is thoroughly within this 3D
it's just
space.
beautifully done. Beautifully. I mean, like I said, I was ready to ask you, how are they doing that? I mean, it's just, he only cuts into stop action for the humans only when it's needed. It's just like there are a couple places where he does it, and then it's only for like a couple frames, and then it's back to live people. And of course, the guys when they're in the mouth of the dinosaur, then of course it's stop action individuals. But
Or like when you mentioned,
but not all of them.
Yeah.
When the kid's picked up, he's not stop action. He's the real kid being flown through the air.
No, he's not.
Yes, he is.
No, he's not, Rocco. When you're seeing that pteranodon flying through the air, that's a stop action figure that he's carrying.
No, I think it's the kid, isn't it?
No, Rocco, they did not like have a kid on a zip line flailing around.
That's what I thought they did.
No,
I thought they maybe had someone on a zip line, and the kid was being picked up.
No, Dad,
the
the
line.
kid is also animated.
It's animated?
Yeah, the kid is also
Well, it's
animated.
whatever it is. If
It looks really good. It it looks
But the close-up, he's animated. It's not. With the close-up,
the close-up is not
Right,
animated.
right,
The
right.
close-up is the actual.
But it's really amazing that the couple places where it just works, like I was mentioning how they're getting the lassos around the animal.
Oh yeah, like
realistically.
I mean, that's the big set piece that everybody mentions, where it's like all the cowboys are getting together and throwing their lassos around Gwangi and just fighting with him with all their might. It's like basically what they did was they literally took a jeep with a giant pole that was going to represent Gwangi and basically had the performers just lasso the pole. And then in post, what Ray Harryhausen did was he used a split screen effect where you would sort of have projections of the characters on the screen left and the screen right, but the Allosaurus would mask off the place where the jeep was supposed to be. But then he also had to make these stop action lassos.
Yeah.
And he had to make sure that the lines of these lassos matched perfect, like looking through a tiny viewfinder of a camera. He had to make sure these lassos matched perfectly
Right.
with where the tension point was, but also so he's also animating this figure. He's trying to make the character sort of independently act, but he also needs to make sure that it's responding organically to things that happen in the environment.
Right.
But
I just wanted to comment on that, how beautifully done the animation is. It's absolutely stunning.
I mean, it's just, again, it's
and the animal
not
has
just
character.
Exactly. It has performance. Like
the animal
Gwangi,
has, right?
Yeah, it is like a thoroughly identifiable, it's like, and there's certain aspects of it where it's just like, it's kind of interesting because in a weird way, like Valley of Gwangi, I think might be the latest film that we've ever covered on this podcast, because I think up until this point, besides bonus episodes, the latest film that we've covered was like, I think it was like those beach party horror movies from 64 and 65. Right. Valley of Gwangi.
They were terrible.
Oh, those were awful. I mean, not as bad as the VIPs, but very few things are as bad as the VIPs. But I think it's interesting that the Valley of Gwangi, I mean, this is a movie that's being made in 1969. And not only are Americans not really making like big monster rallies like this anymore, people are also not really making Westerns like this anymore. Like these sort of, like with Tuck Kirby, with James Franciscus as just like this guy who's just this bronze tanned, white suited, like, you know, conniving huckster who's just like, you know, like, you notice, like, I don't think there are any gunfights in the movie. No one whips out a pistol, but like, it's
No.
like,
No,
but
they
it's
get in a fight, but they don't whip out a pistol.
you know, but
But no, they want to see what kind of man you really are. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So take off your belt.
yeah, I mean, like, yeah, exactly. But there's a
Oh no, that's Guy Williams or Guy Madison.
I mean, it's
Sorry,
such
wrong movie.
it's such a classical kind of Western that's being made in a sort of adventurous, morally dualistic Western that's being made in 1969, after like we've already had like the Wild Bunch and
Right.
the spaghetti Western movies,
Yep.
The Man with No Name. And so again, it's like this, these wonderful ways that there's like this meta narrative to the movie, that like, it's not just that the movie is about characters who are playing cowboys in this sort of totemic mythic performance that is losing its relevance. It's that the movie itself as a performance is this thing that is kind of going the way of the dinosaurs. This is this genre that is
Right.
losing its relevance to a much darker, more ambivalent style of storytelling, which again, I think only makes the climax all the more poetic, where it's just like, you really don't know how to interpret it because nobody says anything. You
Right.
have the kid crying, you have the church burning, and you're just like, well, what are we to take from this? What is the lesson here? Like, I guess, yeah, don't like exploit nature, but it seems like
No.
it seems like there's a little bit more, something more nuanced going on.
I think there's something Western about it. That's your luck, right? There goes their money. They can't get their Hippus back because they ran away.
Yeah.
Right.
In a weird way, it is kind of a revisionist Western because it ends with, you know, like this is the logical conclusion of manifest destiny. The very thing that you are trying to, this very like sort of discrete object of desire, this beautiful totem that is going to, number one, it's going to raise a lot of money. You're going to extract something from the natural world, from the natural constitution of the land, and you're going to use it to make yourself rich. But also just in general, the cultural significance of it. In attempting to erect this beautiful myth, this beautiful lie, you just destroy what's already there, which in this case is represented by this Mexican church, where it's like...
Well, not that, the animals.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, yeah, the animals, too. I do think it's notable that only indigenous people die in the movie. Only Mexicans die. Because again, we also have another character who is like, I think it was Carlos. Yeah. Lupe is the little Mexican boy. Carlos Gustavo Rojo. He's playing the sort of rival for TJ Breckenridge's heart. And at one point, he mistakenly thinks that Tuck Kirby is the one who stole the Neo-Hippus and brought it back to the valley. I think it's very interesting that not only is it the one of the Mexican gypsies who gets eaten by Gwangi, and presumably there is also another Mexican, that a few more Mexican casualties that we see. But it's also interesting, I think, that Carlos, you know, he's the one who gets left behind and killed by Gwangi when everyone else escapes. And, you know, it's this great thing because you have, like, again, the classic Carl Denham moment where it's actually Richard Carlson as the ringleader of this Wild West show. We'll recognize Richard Carlson from It Came From Outer Space. He's there.
Well, a lot of movies.
And he's
movies.
Yeah, he's giving this classical Carl Denham speech where he's like, this is, you know, like, we're going to be rich. This is going to be the greatest show on earth. But then he just stops and he's like, wait, where's Carlos? And it's like, well, Carlos is dead. And I think that it is interesting. Again, it's like maybe this kind of ambivalent revisionist Western quality of it, where it's like all of the victims of what these white people do, all of them are brown people. All of them are people who are connected to the land. You break the taboos. And I mean, that's the weird thing is like, you know, what did indigenous Plains Native Americans think of when, you know, how did they interpret fossils, and what did they think about these crazy white men just digging around in the dirt and being so emphatic about these old dried bones and trying to make money off of them. Like these are things, I'm just saying these are things that are like connected to things that actually happen. They may not be intentional, but they are weirdly apt in expressing like the actual history of manifest destiny, and in particular how it's expressed through dinosaurs as a totem of it.
It really was really pretty good. I think I really liked this picture for all those reasons. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, we're going to come back next week. When we come back next week, we're not going to do a double feature next week. We're just going to go with a single movie. But we are going to be reuniting with Irvin Yeworth Jr. You may recognize him as the director of The Blob. He made his own turn at a dinosaur movie. It turns out this one is going to be a official Universal International Studios production, co-financing the film. Apparently, the special effects just for this movie that we're going to be covering cost as much as the entirety of the Blob's production budget itself. So when we come back, we'll be reviewing dinosaurs. But I did want to mention before we go, like, if you guys didn't see, on February 1st, I made a post which is basically just our invitation for you guys to rank the golden age horror films that we reviewed throughout the last 4 months, because we're trying to compile a very special bonus episode where we're kind of going to go through them and we're going to rank them in terms of both what me and Dad think were some of the best ones, and also we want your trenchant insights. We want our viewers and our patrons to participate. So please hit that up. There's a Excel spreadsheet document that I included that you can either comment on the post and rank it just in your comments, or you can use that Excel document and email it to me at monstercraze1@gmail.com. But otherwise, again, join us next week on Monster Craze Memoirs.